Hello everyone, today we talk about the Vandals. I decided to make this video as a series of about the migration era that I noticed is a topic that at least most of you is very interested in, as I could see from my video stats, because I realized that practically the wide majority of the most watched videos from the external, so without me sharing them elsewhere, is really about the migration era. And incidentally, of my almost 200 videos, the most watched is the Alemanni, History of a Germanic People, incredibly. And I'm not just talking about in terms of views that are also pretty high, but also in terms of watch length, which is, by the way, what actually makes the video appreciated in its contents. And the and I notice as well, because this is what I do when I sometimes when I decide to make some dedicated videos, at least, which doesn't happen very often, and just randomly choose them, choose the topics usually. But relatively to this one, I decided to start talking once again about this single peoples of the migration era, because I noticed that on the YouTube there isn't, as a matter of fact, a lot about it. I thought that especially the Anglosphere was particularly interested into the migration period, migration era, whatever you want to call it. But checking out there on YouTube, I talk about the Anglosphere because it's the most prominent, um, let's say, cultural area of influence, we can say, at least today in our Western world. That's the reason why I speak in English in my videos. And I'm glad about it, as a matter of fact. I noticed that there is not much about these populations. There is actually a lot about video games and stuff like that. There is indeed also some university lesson about these or that people, but even there the tone is usually generalist, and I couldn't find an extremely detailed video about this single peoples of the migration era. And today I talk about Vandals because this is when I make videos, it's a chance even for me to learn more about them. I've always been fascinated by them. As a medievalist, because I am a medievalist, and I really don't tell it often, but I began really back in the day from the migration era. Like one of my few field of expertise, actually, as I think any real historian should be, in the sense that we can't be expert about everything. I make lots of videos about lots of different topics, but evidently I'm not expert in all of them. As a matter of fact, not even on most of them. But one of the few topics that I covered extensively, because if anything, I wrote a thesis about this, was the Longobards, and that's the reason why I dedicated to Longobard history a playlist on its own. And eventually I abandoned it. I abandoned actually the whole migration era, not because I disliked it at all. On the contrary, there is another video that I'm telling you the name is Studying the High and Low Middle Ages Methods and Differences. Should be Studying the Early Middle. Maybe I will change the title, but in there I explain why. A bit, first of all, of methods of studying this or that part of history, so I focus on the migration era, and also explain why eventually I switched to the low Middle Ages for my own personal research, which I know that to you probably it's not important, but incidentally I discuss lots about historical method relatively to the different ages, so that might be of interest. And as a great Longobard lover, I was very interested about the Vandals because there is actually I can't say a very strict relation between the two peoples, but really a something in common that derives especially from their origins. One of the great problems of the so starting really with a story about Vandals is that we do not really know in this Central and Eastern European environment of the um, first centuries, actually before and also obviously after Christ, these peoples originated. First of all, it's difficult even to say who were the Vandals. I mean, I'm not really discussing the who were from a cultural point of view, because it's evident that the same name Vandal owned certain meanings that now we will see, and that was used indeed to define something. But who were also in terms of a political group. Were they a tribe? Usually find that they're mentioned as an Eastern Germanic tribe. I like also the term confederation, because you noticed that even though they might have been a sort of tribal, I mean, these we should go into anthropology, but and I'm no expert, so I'm just making you understand more or less the even doubts we have on certain occasions. Were the Vandals a single group, for instance? And first of all, they weren't, because the most prominent parts were of the Vandals were made up by two distinct entities. Seemingly, were the Asdingi and the Silingi, similar to what happened, I don't know, for instance, with the Goths, that eventually split into Visigoths and Ostrogoths, even though in there it was a bit more of a development of what we'll think, while the Asdingi and the Silingi in the Vandals case kind of remained together until actually, well, in Spain, as we will see, that they split up. Then eventually they got in together. But the important thing is that, however, were some sort of unitary thing. But as far as I've read, even the wall block of the Vandals, I mean, we don't at a certain point they enter into contact with the Romans on the Danubian frontier. And therefore, this is how we usually get into touch, first, historically speaking, first of all, in contact with these peoples, because the Romans begin to write about them. So we have more historical evidence of that. Not because there is no historical evidence of these people beyond the Danube, the Danube and the Rhine, but simply because we have a lot of archaeological evidence that, however, doesn't tell us who was who there, because there was no strict in material culture. There was practically no way to distinguish certain people. So if we don't have further historiographical knowledge, either from, I don't know, Roman ethnography or geography, and simple political and military history, we can't even orient ourselves on who was where. And definitely our knowledge about these people's origins are very, very scanty. So about Vandals, we don't even know where they originated, because there is a traditional idea that is basically extended to the whole Germanic populations, that eventually the Roman, let's say the Romano-Germanic historiography indulged very much in later centuries. That is the origin, the Scandinavian origins of the Germanic peoples. So we know this is true because the Germans, what we call the Germans at least, were definitely some populations that came from the far north. We're talking about the Scandinavian peninsula, the Jutland peninsula, and these were Indo-European populations that had migrated in there in very ancient times, probably when the north was a bit milder in climate. Or I don't really know. Telling the truth, it's the other way around, because usually eventually the Germanic expansion seemed to have been caused by a mildening of the climate, for which people survived more, but there was not enough food locally to support them, so they began to migrate towards the south. So take it what it is, and they basically began to push into Central Europe. Central Europe at the time was inhabited by the Celts, So basically the Germans pushed these guys away, or however blended in even with them. We will see with the case of the Vandals. So this is quite important because the Vandals originated in what was seemingly a rather peripheral area of the Germanic world. So we have this idea that they all came from there. The problem is that when we talk about the migration era, and specifically the populations that were formed at that point in the first centuries after Christ, we have to think that these populations were probably they probably had a nucleus of ancient Scandinavian origin, but they had agglomerated, they had agglutinated lots of other people coming from everywhere, literally, to basically make mass and to, move together as one, as a single political entity. So when we talk about this population, especially in the case of the Eastern Germans, we tend to say that probably most of them weren't even of Germanic origin. And the problem is that most of the times we have no evidence to support, this theory or the opposite, because there is no demographical data. Genetics doesn't help because we have very scanty evidence, if none at all. We just have to really look at a map and say, more or less, considering all the movements that existed around that area, and say where were these guys from. So relatively to the name Vandals, there are also various etymologies. There have been people who have connected this to Vandal, so this region of Uppland in Sweden. That is, Vandal is also a very famous place for historical, especially archaeological matters, because it gave, in Swedish prehistory, there's even the name to a wall period that is roughly from the mid of the 6th to the end of the 8th century, because there are a lot of great goods in there that have helped us, try to look at essentially the pre-Viking era in Scandinavia. So we don't really know either from, the Vandals have often even been associated with well, let's stick to etymologies for a little. So there are also other Vend, let's say, places like the Vends Isel in Denmark, or also other places that people have just speculated. In my opinion, it doesn't even matter more than much. Actually, the real etymology, because it doesn't matter more than much to say, oh, they came from this place, because probably that's something we'll never know, and that it doesn't have even much sense to say that, even for the populations that whose origins we know relatively better, or best even, like the Longobards, for instance, that I'm expert on, the only ones I'm expert on. We more or less have an area where they originated, and yeah, Sweden, usually this Gotland, has been since ancient times, because since back into those days, actually the Roman historiography that was eventually adopted by the same Germans as a written tradition emphasized that. I mean, the Goths came from Gotland, according to this legend, and it's possible that that original nucleus came from there, but today we know that the Goths were probably some of the most mixed populations that also had a very very complex ethnogenesis, very far away from probably from the Germanic lands. And we know, historiographically speaking, that their myth of the origin has been largely made up, actually, to fit the, let's say, the classical standards of the Roman world, because the Goths were the guys who were more in touch and with the Roman world, and got more Romanized, and had to have a sort of presentable identity. That in this sense they were eager to adopt, even if they probably didn't know pretty much where they originated. Probably they They, however, had they had the knowledge that probably their origin were much more mixed. So in the case of the Vandals, the etymology of the name seemingly comes from the Germanic verb, Proto-Germanic vandiana, vand, that is essentially in English today is to wander. Mm? And this is evidently a name that fits pretty well with the ones that these groups of populations gave themselves during the migration era, meaning that this wasn't really the people's name, but it was the name of the people when it migrated. This is something that I've talked about extensively for the Alemanni in their own in the video dedicated to them. And this is very important because it tells you how basically these were all peoples with a sort of tribal identity on their own, pre-existing. So there is even a continuity, as we will see with certain local tribes. But when they got together, they chose a name, which was usually a pretty standard thing. Like even in the case of the Vandals, it means the wanderers. It's like a nickname. It's like the Alemanni, it means all the men. But seemingly the Alemanni still called themselves at home Suebians. That's same for the Franks. They came from a bunch of tribes along the Weser, including part of the ones that had defeated the Romans' Battle of Teutoburg force, so they all had their own names, but they called themselves the Franks because they called themselves the ones who were free. So these were all kind of nicknames that they chose when they became peoples on the march. And what a better name than the Wanderers if you are on the march. Because by the way, the Vandals, among many other the many other populations, Germanic populations of migration era, were actually the Globetrotters. Really, they were the ones who made more back and forth in a certain sense, even if they also broadly followed a certain direction as a logics. Partly because that's how I got it. They weren't probably very cohesive population. I mean, populations were much stronger in their core, and the Vandals were a bit, more insecure. I don't know how to say that, unstable, probably, as we will partly see. Relatively to the etymology of the Vandals, there is also the term the mythological figure into the Germanic tradition of the Aurvandil, that is the shining wanderer, dawn wanderer, the evening star, whatever you want to call it. That is usually associated to, it's one of the Germanic Dioscuri. You know that in all the Indo-European religions there are the Dioscuri as a sort of figure of mythological figures, so probably these were that's the same from which, I don't know, figures like Mithra came from, the Greeks Dioscuri, even I think Romulus and Remus in the Roman case. I mean, there is something out there in the world, in the European world about it. And what is fascinating about this Germanic Dioscuri is that you still find them as these two princes, essentially these two figures, even in the epics of Snorri Sturluson, so very late in time, 13th century, that names Vinil and Vandil. So the idea of Vinil and Vandil, who was Vinil? Vinili was the original name of the Longobards, and that's why I mentioned them at the beginning, because in the original founding myth of the Longobards, there is essentially the story that the Vinili migrated into what we think today was the island of Rügen, the Rugiland. And they met the Vandals there, This is because the founding myth of the Longobards is extremely fascinating and probably very historically accurate one, considering the whole picture, because we have many cross evidence of that was saying the truth, and this was happening around 100 BC. So think about how old that is. And the fact that the Vandals were found, the problem is Vinili arrived in Rogaland and there were the Vandals there. So the Vandals asked the Vinili to pay a tribute to pass. The Vinili basically vote themselves to Woden. The whole story is a bit more complex, but it's fascinating. So they get Woden as their adoptive father, and they get the tribal name of the Longobards, because the Longbird was one attribute of Odin. Woden is the ancient Odin, and so they defeat the Vandals in battle. They don't pay to anyone, so the Longbirds like to be free and victorious, and eventually went into from there afterwards even into the where they dwelled in the Bardegau in Saxony along the Elbe. But it's very fascinating because it tells you that the Vandals at that time were still in what seemingly was, I mean, if that was Rogaland, it was the island of Rügen. I mean, that's just across the sea, the Baltic Sea from Sweden. So the idea is that the Vandals probably had migrated in there very shortly before, so that we usually think they came in there around 120 BC or something. I mean, these are all very arbitrary data. We don't really own the truth, but what we know is that theoretically both Jordanes in his Getica and even the Gotlandige Gotha saga tells that the Goths and the Vandals, and this is also very meaningful because often the Vandals are also associated to the Goths, migrated from southern Scandinavia to those lands that are essentially comprehended between the Oder and the Vistula. So the sorry, about really the data when this happened, actually there is evidence that this might happen a lot before, like the 2nd century, even previous to the 2nd century BC. So relatively to the Vandals, I was just speculating to when, relatively to the Longobards, where they came. But this is not something I've found that mentioned very often, but it's very important that still the Longobards that came relatively late into the continent from Scandinavia compared to the other Germans actually found the Vandals to be already there, because eventually the Vandals shifted towards an area that was much southeast than that, and in the very core of I wouldn't even say Central Europe, because that was really more Eastern Europe than anything. In fact, they were in the areas of today's southern Poland. In fact, relatively to the origins of the of the Vandals, we think that especially that's been really the place when they took a greater shape as a larger people, and those were lands that weren't Germanic. They had been historically Celtic, because the Germanic didn't, while coming from the north down toward the south, didn't just push the Celts into westwards, like only to Gaul. There were lots of Celts were also in the east. The Celts arrived up to the Ukraine. I mean, they really were a big people, and the the Vandals seem to have dwelled there. And as a matter of fact, it seems that their name was taken actually afterwards there, and that the Vandals would be nothing but the tribe of the Lugii. When you find spelled Lugii, note that that's Latin, and it doesn't sound like Lugii. It's the Lugii, so that's a notion, just if you want to tell the Latin name correctly. And this is valid because it's basically the male plural for almost all the Latin names for populations and clans and all. So when you find E is spelled II, it's not EI, it's E. This is, I don't know why this is so. I don't know if it's been really anglicized at the point that you know that maybe in Latin it's the Luigi, but in English you still say Lugii. But it just sounds, I mean, since it's the same name, just spell it correctly because it doesn't cost you anything. Um, and since you are able to make the E sound, so there is no problem with that. It's not like me that I cannot spell English correctly because um, certain sounds do not belong to my native tongue. It's really here that you have that sound, but you deliberately decide not to use it when you should. Relatively to this, we were the Lugi, by the way. The Lugi were a tribe whose origin is very disputed because they've always dwelled seemingly around the Germanic world in this southeastern part. But their origin has always been disputed because we don't know, as a matter of fact, and as it often happens in the migration era, it doesn't even make sense to ask yourself which kind of ethnicity they were, aside from the dominant, maybe the one of the in which let's say in which the local elites identified. So they were probably a mix of populations of Celts, of Germans, possibly also of Proto-Slavs, interestingly, so that I don't know how this notion is true, but recently I've heard people saying actually that the Vandals were possibly even a sort of Proto-Slavic population rather than Germanic one. And there's probably some truth in it because really we don't know much about the Slavs. Really, the Romans left us knowledge about essentially only the populations who dwelled around their borders. So in the deep heart of Central and Eastern Europe, we don't really know what was going on, and definitely the Slavs originated somewhere down around that area. So it's possible that the Vandals partly had big numbers of these guys, as well as other populations actually coming also from more eastwards than there, such as the Iranian peoples in part, as we will see will happen because the Alani will eventually mix up into the Vandals, but that happened later, however, not in this ethnogenetical moment. So, relatively to their origins, we can add, as we were saying before, that there was a lot similarly strict contact with the Goths in some fashion. The Vandals are often associated with the, I don't know how it's spelled in Polish, but it should be Przeworsk culture, something like that. There is one of these cultures that essentially dwell into the upper Oder and Vistula basin between the 3rd and 5th century BC, and considering the geographical locations, been often associated with the Vandals. So we were the Lugi, as we were saying, and this is being said actually, so that the Lugi was the tribal name, originally speaking, plus other people that came in, who eventually called themselves the Vandals when they were put in motion by the during the 2nd century AD, when essentially the Germanic world began to put itself once again into motion after that the Romans had managed initially basically to confine it into this corner formed by the Rhine and the Danube. So we're not gonna discuss why from the 2nd century AD there was a lot there was the start of this new movement of populations that eventually didn't stop up to the end of the migration era, and even telling where the migration era ended it's something difficult. But let's say that there were probably economical crises because these populations, albeit semi-nomadic, weren't really happy to move. I mean, when you move, there is usually a negative reason to it. Because either there are no resources anymore in the place where you stay, either you're pushed by someone else. Sure, you might have a profitable situation, a profitable, let's say, I mean, maybe there is a very wealthy land just next to you. You want to move in there, but usually this is a pretty ideal situation. The whole environment was quite poor, so if anything, those things happened where other people were set in motion by usually negative causes. So it was a pretty dramatic moment in the history of Europe. These populations began essentially to invest initially the Roman borders into the west, because that's where these Germanic tribes dwelt around. So the famous Marcomannic Wars saw actually the participation even of part at least of the Vandals, of these Astingi or Astingi or whatever you want to call it, that moved south. And actually they moved into Dacia as allies of Rome. Then they caused problems because obviously they weren't that nice in general. I mean, the niceries at the time were pretty formal, I'd say. They just needed new lands to dwell in, and naturally the Germans didn't consider themselves as, you know, being accepted by the you know, by the Romans as, you know, as the you know as this submitted, this obedient and dependent population. They felt themselves as, you know, we need that land, let's obviously make a deal with the Romans, but we are still the Germans, we're still free, we are still not under Rome. Then the reality changed, because obviously most of these states were these populations were, as a matter of fact, Roman client states. So, but that's the ambiguity of the whole thing. I mean, especially in migration era, you can't understand this double perspective being always out there, given the instability of the whole system. Everybody was kind of trying to take its own opportunity to exploit new opportunities at the expense of someone else. If this didn't cause too many troubles as a consequence. So there were other populations. Now it's very complicated. We don't really know. They were still dwelling into this Danubian frontier. Aurelian in 271 AD kind of kept stemming them. At a certain point, however, the greatest problem of the Vandals was having settled definitely in this area comprehended between Dacia and the middle Danube, that the Goths, that were definitely a bigger group than the Vandals were, began essentially to move in southwards and pushing the Vandals away. So the Vandals were eventually also defeated by the Goths in battle. The King Genseric killed the Visigoth, the Vandalic King Visimar in battle. So usually we know this even from scanning evidence. So when you read in the migration era, in this kind of misty, historically misty environment, which we don't have many certainties, when you read something that a king was killed, well, that it can be that might have actually happened. It probably happened, but it might be also sort of metaphorical thing, meaning that first of all, these guys didn't have one king, so they had many kings at once, because there were all many tribes put together. So there was probably a prominent leader that was usually the guy to whom was entrusted also the process of especially military business, but also the strictly migratory one, because when you move you need a leader. So that's how certain Germanic monarchies actually were born. But usually when these guys settled down, they didn't have a real king anymore. They didn't need a chief anymore, if not for other problems like actually the continuous ongoing wars that they had to face against other populations, but it was very fluid. But the knowledge we have about the information that a king was killed actually means a lot, because the death of a king in this sense means that a consistent part of these people had been, can say wiped out, but say that the people had suffered very heavy defeat that at that time could usually also equate to the defeat of the world people and the absorption of the people into another one, as it often happened during migration era. And I think this is the case because then we know that the Vandals around the 30s of the 4th century asked Constantine, the Roman Emperor, Constantine the Great, to basically to settle permanently into on the right bank of the Danube. Actually, they had already migrated in there, and it wasn't really a big a problem because these populations, as we've often said in the videos about the migration era, could form a sort of shield from other populations. If you're interested about this, I made a video recently that is called Roman Germanic Relations during the migration era, and I discussed that at length. So yeah, basically this meant that they became Roman allies, and seemingly the Vandals dwelled in this Danubian region of the empire of Pannonia for 60 years, which is not a few. And that was a sort of, this actually proves how the Germans considered the Roman Empire as a sort of safe harbor. This wasn't really about pillaging the place, because the German usually pillaged places that, like any other nomadic people, where they eventually wouldn't settle, because that would have been pretty stupid. I mean, you risk your life, the whole existence of your people for conquering a land, you raise it to the ground, which, I mean, unless you don't have to move away, that doesn't really make much sense. So the Vandals made this had made in the previous centuries, in part also certain incursions along the Danubian frontier in small bands to pillage and to have this kind of, I mean, the local bands of the comitatus, these Germanic warlords obviously had some interest from there, but this is a much broader strategic interest that is basically saving your skin, or at least preventing your people to be swallowed by a much bigger one like the Goths, and finding new land to settle, and the safe harbor was the Roman Empire. So kind of a very good deal for both sides involved. So basically this is the thing, the Goths pushed the Vandals even southwards. This is the point in which, as we've seen, the Vandals and Goths have always kind of been akin to each other, so their relations weren't just warfare. And this is the moment into, by the way, the Vandals get Christianized during the reign of the Emperor Valens, so between the 60s and the 70s of the 4th century. So always under this Roman influence, partly accepted, just like the Goths had done, Arianism. As we've said many times in our migration era videos, Arianism was was a Christian heresy in practice, how you want to call it, at least compared to the Nicene Orthodoxy, and had been accepted by the Germans because it was Christianity still, but it was a kind of I mean, Arius, I mean, there is all the point that this is something that spread among the Goths, so the idea was that the Germans were Arians and the Romans were Orthodox. And that wasn't really tied to high theological speculations. As a matter of fact, Arianism was formulated in that fashion, make it as a form of Christianism to make it more digestible from the Germans, who were completely say unaware of the greater theological debates of the monotheisms of the sedentary civilizations and all philosophy and all these things. They had simpler beliefs, and Arianism kind of fitted into their mind, but really the real thing was that these populations weren't really Christian at that point. Were still largely pagan, or they were Christian and pagan at the same time, because if you are a polytheist, there is nothing strange about it. I mean, the term polytheist is a monotheistic invention. The idea in the polytheistic world is that as many gods can help you, the better it is. So essentially, we're both Christian and pagan at the same time. And they probably didn't even understand Christianism, but it was still a way for the Germanic elites to say to be acceptable for the Christian Romans, but to the Roman Christians better, but still saying we as Germans are Arians. So Arianism was kind of the flag of Germanism in some way, in the way at least they meant them, not in the modern sense of the term. So it was a way to maintain their own identity, their own difference, their own distance from the Roman models that they admired, but they couldn't at all accept, because they had a wholly different culture and they felt that culture to be superior to the Roman one. Only very few Germans actually converted straight away from paganism to Catholicism, like the Franks, and this is incidentally this was done in fact because those were the guys that for political and military reasons had more conveniency to be full allies of the Romans. Others weren't. So that's how it really happened. It wasn't about religion, it was really about politics. However, there were still some Orthodox Vandals. Some of them, one of the most prominent one was the Roman Magister Militum Stilicho, who was actually half Vandal and half Roman, and he was a Catholic. Because obviously, first of all, he was a Roman, so kind of normal that in that case he would be one. But let's say that in this sense, the Christianization of these populations was very heterogeneous in even within the same peoples. I mean, even personal beliefs can vary, so that is a pretty normal thing. So at this point, I've tried to check before making these videos to try to understand where actually what was the case for the Vandals, but it seems to me that certain Vandals actually had remained in part in the north, aside from the larger group that existed at this point, at the beginning of the 5th century on the banks of the Danube. And this would have been really normal because it happened for many other populations that one part migrated and another one remained where they were originally speaking. This happened for the Longobards, it happened for the Saxons, it happened for many Germanic populations. This seems the case of the Vandals, but the real earthquake that put everything in motion at this point is that really subverts all the equilibrium of even of the Romano-Germanic relations and changes the face of the migration era forever, is the arrival of the Huns. So I made a videos in here into which I always in the migration era playlist, which is called How the Huns Transformed the Migration Era, that actually deals with this specific. So if you're interested to see how the whole thing happened, with the broader implication of these of the Hunnic invasions and the subsequent movements that were triggered by it, had on late antique history. So basically, the Huns conquered the whole Germanic world. At least geographically speaking, the whole Central and Eastern Europe was formally under their control. So the word Germans that actually remained in Germany or in Eastern Europe or wherever they were at that point when the Huns arrived, and and they got subjugated. They became Hunnic subjects, and obviously the Hunnic domination translated itself in a sort of tribute paying from these populations. I mean, the Huns weren't this developed civilization in the sense that they didn't have a state. They were not they were fully nomadic. Actually, the Germans at this point were kind of semi-nomadic. The Huns came from the heart of the steppes, so they had a very different culture. So the usual cultural the usual means of control of these populations was essentially to have the subjects paying a tribute to them. And there were many Germans that actually fought within the Huns, even with a various degree of freedom, like the Ostrogoths, for instance, were very much respected by the Huns, simply because they were stronger. They had good cavalry, like just similar to the Huns, where other populations that instead were kind of more the I can say the slaves, but I mean those who didn't have a great contractual power and that just lived passively the Hunnic presence, or that, however, maybe found it profitable to side with them. For instance, the Longobards, even though we don't know much about them in this sense, seemingly were the guys who remained the longest under the Huns, even after the death of Attila. And this explains, by the way, why they were such skilled horsemen, why they had such a strong... I mean, but maybe we'll discuss that better about Longobards specifically. However, there were lots of other Germanic peoples, including the Vandals and even and Visigoths, for instance, differently from the Ostrogoths. So this is very interesting because you see splitting in this sense even within some peoples, and also especially lots of populations of Iranian origin, like the Alani, for instance, were a Sarmatian tribe that didn't want at all to be under the Hunnic yoke and decided to move west. So this triggered, in a moment of great difficulty of the Western Roman Empire, actually, a sort of domino effect for which all these populations that that wanted to escape from the Hunnic conquests entered at a certain point uncontrolled into the Roman borders. This is what happened famously, and this is the problem sticking to the Vandals. This is probably a moment in which all the various Vandalic groups, or at least most of them, joined together once again and went west together with other populations like the Alans, the Burgundians. There were actually lots of them, and tried to push westwards across the Rhine. Now the problem is that the Rhine, already at that point, had been guarded by Roman federati, that is Roman allies of Germanic origins, chiefly the Franks, that, as we were recalling before, had taken their space in Gaul by essentially accepting their role as Roman allies. Obviously also the Franks weren't that sympathetic with Roman government. They fought against the Roman Empire at times as well, but they were the guys who in that specific strategic theater had the greater convenience to show themselves as fully, let's say, supportive of the Romans. And what was happening there is that the Romans had entrusted to the Franks certain lands of the Gallia Belgica that had been depopulated. So it's not that they had given them who knows what, but it was still land, and it was still, a good place to go. And the Franks obviously saw this human tide of peoples who was coming there, and they stood against them. So seemingly the Vandals crossed. I mean, eventually in 406, this whole human tide made it because the Franks couldn't hold them for long. But seemingly the Vandals fought alone, were among the first populations, even if they were crossing, and fought against the Franks, and they were defeated in battle. So the Franks managed to stem the Vandals. This is also interesting because it tells you, I mean, the Franks weren't this excessively mighty power at that time, but evidently the Vandals weren't either. This actually makes me suggest, I mean, they had been defeated by the Goths, they had been defeated by Franks, they weren't probably this huge power at that time. So eventually the Alans arrive and they help the Vandals, so the Franks are defeated, and famously, traditionally, on December the 31st of 406, the Vandals cross the Rhine together with all these well-loaded peoples, entering in Gaul. So the situation there was pretty messed up because Gaul was a very rich land for those time standards, but still it had suffered like the whole Roman Empire and of demographical economical crisis. So the Franks had already settled in there, the Alemanni partly too. The Burgundians were also settling essentially in that region where they remained historically. So peoples like the Visigoths, excuse me, I keep saying the Visigoths for I don't know for which reason instead of Vandals, because they both start with V probably. They, like the Vandals and the Alans, wandered a little bit around Gaul, pillaging and messing up, increasing even more the situation. But they soon realized that they basically couldn't dwell in there because the situation, the place was already too crowded. So basically, what they did was to cross into Spain. So crossing the Pyrenees and entering to this other region of the empire that was also pretty florid. Usually Spain was, especially the south of it, was one of the richest and most urbanized Roman provinces, and so it was a profitable area to settle. So eventually the settlement took place in this fashion. The Vandals split in two. The Silingi, settled in the south, in the Hispania Baetica. So it would be today's Andalusia, substantially. The Asdingi in the north, in Galatia. I don't remember where Galatia or Asturia, but it's still this northwestern region of the Iberian Peninsula. So this is interesting because it tells you, by the way, that these two populations kind of still, I mean, usually the Germanic confederations that moved were moving as one. The fact that the Vandals split in two as two distinct tribal entities substantially into the north and south of Spain respectively tells you that probably this wasn't a very cohesive people, and that adds up to what we were saying before relatively to the fact that the Vandals probably weren't this great mighty power, because at that point really what you see is that in migration era the most successful peoples were the ones who had a greater national cohesion. I mean, it wasn't really a matter of I don't know, how their military was pretty homogeneous, so there were definitely certain social factors that influenced military effectiveness, but most of all it was the idea of moving as one. And what it seems at this point is that the Vandals weren't that cohesive. At the same time, the Vandals entered Spain together with the Alani, we instead settle into the Alans. I don't know. You say Alani is the ancient name, then Alans is the Anglicization in Lusitania, so roughly today's Portugal. And also partly, I think the Alani kind of were partly also in the middle, like around the city of Carthago Nova on the Mediterranean, so bits crossing a bit in the mid of Spain. Mm. Carthago Nova would be today's Cartagena, as it's kind of bears the name, um, the ancient name. There were also the Swabians, part of the Swabians that were this huge one of the first confederations actually, from which also other many other these populations came from, settled partly into Galatia, yes, and they remained there for long before they were eventually absorbed by the Visigoths, more or less. Now, the problem here is that the Visigoths came into play because the Visigoths at this point had just sacked Rome and had migrated from Italy to this region in southern France, in Occitane, that is called Septimania. Septimania is this stripe, essentially it goes from Provence to Spain, around the coast of the Mediterranean. It's called in this fashion seemingly because it took 7 days to cross it. I don't know. I think on foot, not on horse. I don't know. On foot, maybe 1 week. It's too. I don't know. Well, it took 7 days to cross it. Surely on horseback you could make it earlier, but I mean, this is at least the etymology that I knew about it. So the Visigoths were instead, at that time at least, a power to be reckoned with. They had been essentially in the meat grinder of the Roman army, fighting both for the Romans and against the Romans, so they had received a decent school. Probably part of their strengths had also been weakened, especially for all the defeats that they suffered at the hands of Stilicho. Who knows what did Stilicho thought about his Vandalic origins in this sense. And the Visigoths at that point start to cross into Spain proper too. I mean, keeping still this region of southern France that eventually would have lost in the 6th century because of the Merovingian expansion. And they enter into Spain because it was a very wealthy land. As we were saying, very rich, very Romanized, especially in the center and the south. And they defeat the Alans. Mm. And not just the Alans, but after that the Silingi. Mm. We were practically nearly wiped out. So the Vandal king Gunderic, which at this point was he was an Asding himself, so he was part of the nucleus that eventually hadn't suffered. He accepted basically the remains. I mean, he absorbed, integrated into his Asdingi tribe all the remains of the Silingi and of the Alans. So a very interesting thing about this is that he took the name of Rex Vandalorum et Alanorum, that is king of the Vandals and of the Alans. So that also tells you a lot relatively to the Vandals, because if they had been another people, they would have still claimed themselves to be king of the Vandals, point. Adding end of the Alans was prestigious indeed, but it was also essentially a bit to sort of denature, I don't know how to say that, its own fully Vandalic identity. So as we have said, the Vandalic identity was probably already, the Vandal identity was still pretty relatively weak. It kind of made sense to boast the fact that they had absorbed the Alans, that had been actually mighty people back in the day. They were a ferocious enemy of the Romans, were probably the best cavalrymen of the Sarmatians. I mean, there was a great pride also felt relatively to these traditions. Obviously, we don't know much about it, but we can essentially grasp it. We can um, um, kind of um, um, of realizing it, because it was really the migration era was really about this process of integration, and from that, from how it was declined in various situations, you can't really understand much even about the politics, the nature of these peoples, the various characteristics of the single populations. So at this point, the Vandals were quite worried about the Visigoths, so they fled back into the south, where they were also claimed that it was the official passage from the official proclamation of Gunderic from king of the Silingi, also king of the Silingi, were because the Silingi had, as we've said, were there in the south. And Gunderic in 422 decisively defeated a Roman Suebic Gothic coalition at the Battle of Tarraco. And this was very important because it granted the Vandals a certain degree of autonomy at that point, and probably also granted their survival for later times. From that point, the Vandals went wild in some measure, because they realized probably that they wouldn't have remained there for long. They began to raid the Balearic Islands, Hispania, Mauritania. They and launched raids into other regions of Baetica. So this is what I was saying before, that they were kind of putting up a decent booty to eventually move somewhere else. So destroying the local places to eventually move out. And Gunderic died in 428, and he was succeeded as a Vandal king by Genseric or Gaiseric. When we say Genseric, we as many as other names, we're essentially telling the Anglicization of the Latinized Germanic name. The real name of Genseric was Gaiseric. So it's also interesting to look at the etymologies of these names now. We don't have enough time, but still worth the mention. And Genseric is widely regarded as probably one of the greatest leaders of the Germanic leaders of the migration era. He was actually, we'll discuss it now, we'll see what he did, then maybe draw some conclusion about him, because he's really an outstanding figure. He was, by the way, son of, he was an illegit, he was Gunderic half-brother. And he was an illegitimate because he was son of a Roman slave. So it's also interesting to see, you see with Genseric, Stilicho, all figures that belonged partly to the Germanic world and partly to the Roman one. So they also felt this affiliation. And that was also quite useful, politically speaking, because you could really appreciate, let's say, you could understand both cultures, and that is very meaningful when you have to deal with this very chaotic political and military situation in what it was the migration era at that point. And the Vandals under Gaiseric crossed to Africa in 429. At this point, the Vandals were probably a decently strong Germanic people. One of the problems in assessing the power of these confederations is really to say how many they were, because as we've said, from a military point of view, they were almost all fighting in the same fashion. There weren't really these huge differences. So it was really about internal cohesion, and also which is also partly reflected by how many people could be put together. The Vandals at this point might have counted like 80,000 people, so considering that all the able male adults were warriors, and that was still their 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 lifestyle essentially as a semi-nomadic population. They probably had an army of 15-20,000. At least these are modern estimates, and it kind of makes sense. So you see that there weren't huge numbers really, but considering the crisis of the late antique world, I mean, such numbers were still enough to make it in some way, and as we will see here. Basically, the Vandals crossed to Africa. We don't know whether because they were called by the Romans of Africa because there were some rebellions into Roman Africa, so the Roman Africa was extremely wealthy. This is important to remember. Roman Africa it's not North Africa. It's actually roughly what is modern day Tunisia, and that was together with southern Spain and western Turkey and obviously Italy and Greece, and southern France, I'd say too, one of the mostly urbanized, one of the wealthiest and most populated areas of the Roman Empire. I forgot Egypt, by the way. Egypt, it's pretty obvious on its own. The reason for this wealth is that, well, I don't know, the environmental factors. Tunisia has a certain climate, certain territory that evidently favors, say, agriculture more than other North African lands. And since ancient times, as a matter of fact, had been the granary of Rome, of Italy, let's say. Originally, in the days of the Republic, it had been Sicily. That was also the most fertile lands of the world at the time. Sardinia, partly, that though it doesn't have much, but similarly there was consistent agricultural production even in there. But Africa was really a big thing. And at this time, especially in a time of, like the 5th century, in time of demographical shortage, of problem of keeping the statal structure standing on their feet in the Roman Empire and all, these agricultural resources were crucial. Like Italy depended on Africa for grain, from supplies and all, just like Constantinople depended on Egypt. So what you see, in fact, is that the West fell when it lost Africa, and let's say Constantinople shrank dramatically when the Arabs conquered Egypt. So these granaries were, let's say, extremely important from a strategical point of view, and plus Africa was an extremely developed land. I mean, think about all the great late antique writers. Think about St. Augustine, that incidentally died at the siege of Epona during the Vandal siege. It was one of the most intellectually developed and culturally developed lands of the empire, so a precious, very precious land. And the Vandals were attracted definitely by there, partly because there was, as we were saying, there was a rebellion going on. The Bonifacius was the military ruler of Africa, and he had basically rebelled to Rome, to the Roman Empire, proclaiming himself Roman Emperor. So this was daily business. Actually, revolts in Africa were something very, very they happen very frequently. Also in post-Vandalic times, I mean, Africa was always difficult to be maintained during the late antique period by the Roman Empire, because the local resources favored local rulers to emerge. It's obvious that from Italy and from Constantinople, someone had to be sent there on the distance in a decentralized government, and decentralization favored these revolts. Many other figures, even if you think about Heraclius, was essentially a rebel from the African of the always part of the Roman administration that had rebelled and come out from there. So it was a very unstable and tumultuous area. Africa had known this actually also in terms of problems with the heresies. Think about Donatism. There had been a lot of troubles in the countryside. It was very fertile, so there were brigands that took that exploited this chance of political instability to create other further instability and all. So what a better strategic target than an extremely wealthy and extremely politically fragmented place. So the Vandals arrived to Africa, I think, already with that in mind. And the main cities were Hippo, Regius, and Carthage, famously. So these two coastal cities of Carthage. Is not really the ancient Carthage because the Romans had razed it to the ground, and eventually Julius Caesar rebuilt it, so it's kind of the same city, yeah, but was the Roman city. And Hippo Regius was also historically an important city there. And what happened is that the Vandals arrived in there. We don't know whether, because this is always how it happened at the time, we don't understand whether these guys were called by the Romans because it was habitual practice, or if they went there voluntarily, or both things. The result, however, is that Vandals besieged Hippo Regius. The city was taken. That was the first base, really, where the Vandals basically it was taken. Carthage was still out there, so Bonifacius at this time was fighting actively against the Vandals because he understood that we're about to seize power. There was a lot of worry into Italy for this situation because it was perfectly understood that if the Vandals had seized Africa, they could have done a great mess. So the daughter of the Roman Emperor Theodosius the First, Aelia Galla Placidia, who was regent for Valentinian III from 423 to until 437, if I'm not wrong. So when he came to age, at that time had an army raised to be sent to Africa. The Genseric actually defeated both Bonifacius and these new forces that had come to defeat him, to destroy him, and he fully controlled Hippo Regius actually, and in 435 he managed even to take Carthage after having defeated the other resistance. Actually, the city was captured without fighting, and seemingly this happened while the inhabitants were watching attending the races at the hippodrome there. But these are kind of I mean, I don't believe that personally. I mean, it's possible that they sneaked in some way, which was perfectly possible, telling the truth, but very often at this point into late antique literature, Roman literature, you see that the Romans were perceiving the crisis, the decline, so they wanted to stress the kind of the even their own moral decay in a certain sense. So it was easy to have this kind of almost ridiculous reasons for which such dramatic events would happen, but maybe reality, surely, by the way, reality was a bit more complicated. Now there is a big deal of of relatively to well, first of all, let's finish this passage and then I will comment on. Basically, once the Vandals had seized Carthage and Hipporegus, they had basically the whole Africa under control. This gave them an excruciatingly favorable strategic position to do a big mess. As a matter of fact, the Vandals transformed necessarily themselves into mariners. The reasons why they happened is that obviously the southern Europe was just out there. It just took to cross from Africa into Italy, into Greece, into Spain. Also into Gaul, which was, I think, the only place where the Vandals were defeated in one of their incursions, and also in Greece at a certain point. But it was pretty much evident that from Carthage they could kind of do what the Carthaginians had done. I mean, this essentially certain. I mean, the geography of the world is always the same. So from Carthage, the Vandals seized by way Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. They launched raids into the Balearic Islands, into Greece, and famously, they came to sack Rome in 455. This all happened on the very long reign of Genseric, who definitely is the he had an extremely long reign. He actually ruled from 428 to 477, so he actually outlived the last Western Roman emperor. So he actually won, and well, we discussed this maybe later because I already wanted to say it before. What I want to say is that the sack of Rome, and here the idea of the Vandals were these actually great destroyers, is a bit of a, I can say, of a myth, but and the idea is that the Vandals, just like all the Germanic populations, didn't want to destroy the Roman civilization. On the contrary, they enjoyed its benefits and wanted essentially to keep them alive. What happened with Rome was a bit what had happened with the Visigoths. The Rome was basically without defense, because it was very difficult to this time to maintain an army. 455 was already very deep crisis into Italy, also in terms of resources and all, and resources availability, manpower, and all. So actually, the arrival of the Vandals was kind of formalized by the fact that Valentinianus III had been Roman emperor, had been assassinated. So Valentinianus' daughter Eudocia had been promised in spouse to Genseric's son Huneric. So the idea was that Genseric felt himself that he needed to intervene. So from the African shores he reached the Tiber mouth, and for 2 weeks he put Rome under sack. Now we know that these sacks were carried out usually in a sort of controlled fashion. I mean, it wasn't just these guys entering in and destroying everything they found, as you find in 19th century paintings, and that Rome went destroyed. As a matter of fact, Rome didn't go destroyed until the 6th century, when at least it went largely depopulated. This time, sacking Rome, just like it had been for the Visigoths, was basically arranging the sack with local urban authorities. Also the popes at this time were very influential in this sense, so that these guys would pillage, but they wouldn't destroy more than much, they wouldn't kill more than much. As a matter of fact, there is even this image that was actually about Alaric, that he didn't want he punished soldiers who did excessive violences, and we can imagine that there were, because as a matter of fact that's that's a proof. But was still the idea that that was Rome. So even these Germans had respect for Rome. They had respect for this. It was just like it was like a credit card, really. It was like a sort of um, a withdrawal. These guys took away all the gold, all the riches and all, and they went away with their booty, and Rome remained what it was, a bit lighter. Certainly certain buildings destroyed, certainly, but not extensive damage to the city itself. And this was a very easy thing to do, because, by the way, it was a way to say that allowed these Germanic warlords to say, have you seen how magnanimous I've been? I could have destroyed the city, I didn't, I just took all the riches. And this is how more or less happened historically speaking, which is definitely a very negative thing. Surely I would have not liked to be a Roman at that time. But it isn't even that senseless, barbaric, and vandalic, as a matter of fact, destruction that is being portrayed by historiography in very later times, by the way. The Romans did basically the same things. So there are certain necessities that are always out there. These guys needed gold, they needed precious stones, they needed things they could pay their army, for their government and all, and that was a very good way to take money. Rome was one of the I think still the largest city at that time. Well, no, I don't think so, but still one of the largest cities, surely the largest in the western half of the Roman Empire. Still very rich, which by the way tells you that at that time it had not decayed yet. It had partially decayed, but it was still a very wealthy and rich and developed center. It would remain basically for an extremely long time. So and then that was it. So it's interesting also relatively to the Vandalic control of Sicily and of of Sardinia and these other Mediterranean islands, that the Vandals probably didn't really control these territories. I mean, at that time, controlling one place wasn't really stationing permanent troops in there, because that was extremely costly, and especially was a bit senseless. I mean, the most important thing at that point was make trade working. We have archaeological evidence that even during Vandal times, Africa was a very developed area. Trade allow tolls to be exacted, so that's money. When there was a core of power, a pole of power, usually there was a deterrent effect for all the surrounding territories to be essentially to revolve around that power and not be opposed to it. Those lands in the Mediterranean basically didn't even have another a concrete government anymore. Surely, locally speaking, the local cities had their own magistrates. They had a sort of, obviously, a local administration, and possibly they were also happy of this ambiguous state of being not really under Rome, but not really under the Germans, so enjoying this large degree of autonomy into which they could dwell. I think we don't have an extreme evidence of even of a sudden economical collapse of the areas that the Vandals pillaged, at least on a broad scale. Even though surely they hit pretty hard in certain centers, and and they did surely their destructions. So but what I would like especially to talk about is Vandal Africa, because the Vandals, as we were saying, have suffered of this stereotype of destroyers more than other peoples, because they sacked Rome, and a few decades afterwards the western half of the Roman Empire basically finished. So the idea is that these Vandals were the utter destroyers. Papal historiography has also pretty much gone hard on them because they were still Arians. And they formally carried out persecution of the Catholics in the local in the territories that they controlled. Telling the truth, there is no historical evidence whatsoever to claim that the Vandals were better or worse than other Germanic populations in terms of destruction. Not that they were particularly harsh in terms of persecution. Archaeology actually tells us that, I mean, we have, just to make an example, we have certain sources that tell us that these Vandals, obviously they were Catholic sources, that tell us that the Vandals arrived and destroyed all the dioceses and all the churches and of the Catholics. And archaeologically speaking, is there evidence of this? Of all the African dioceses, there were something like, I don't know, I think 200, because it was a hugely developed and urbanized area. We have evidence of only one diocese archaeologically to have been destroyed at that time, and we don't obviously even know how it went destroyed. So you understand that before that archaeological data, if you had to rely just on that historiography, you would have thought that the Vandals were these great destroyers. As a matter of fact, they weren't. And they weren't not because they were good people, because you know, you don't have to reason in this fashion. We're not here to determine what was good or what was bad. We don't care. I personally don't care. What I care about is the evidence, and the evidence is really something also attached to logics. I mean, as we were saying before, you have this extremely rich region of the Western Roman Empire, extremely developed, extremely wealthy, extremely urbanized, administered. You want to settle in there, and you do settle in there, because after having crossed like from Central Europe, then to Western Europe, then to Southern Europe, then to Northern Africa, definitely you settle there to stay. The idea is that it doesn't make any freaking sense to destroy the magnificent place that you have, and you could even only dream, you couldn't even even dream about when you were in Germany, just for no reason, because you're a stupid barbarian. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. And these guys were obviously intelligent people who realized that that was a great accomplishment to have seized those lands, and eventually all they did was to keep it. And we have actual, even historical evidence that first of all, Roman Africa, from a religious point of view, kept being in relation with Constantinople, with Rome. I mean, it was normal business. It's not that when the Vandals arrived, these regions were closed to the rest of Rome at all. It was still open. Most actually of the Roman-Vandal relations at this point were positive, were peaceful, and we know that from other sources. I don't remember whether from Constantinople or from Rome. Well, we know that the Catholic communities of Africa under the Vandals were still electing their own bishops. Persecutions did happen, for sure, but they weren't this murderous and destructive thing that we imagined. Like the persecution basically got down on average in the late antique world. This was done even by the Catholics towards the heretics, as it had happened in Africa itself. First of all, for reasons that had nothing, or almost nothing to do with religion itself. Secondly, the whole thing basically turned out in removing the bishop from its seat and putting your own bishop in there. And if this escalated into violence, it was usually from both sides. You just look at what had happened with Donatism, and you realize that has basically nothing to do with religion. It was really about the local communities that wanted to deal their own business on their own, and the central government wanted to do otherwise. And then there was brigandage and certain assassinations, and this is really the whole mess of this world, of this stateless world, because at a certain point was a very large degree of autonomy of organization. So even the Vandal persecutions have to be definitely really mentioned. You don't have to say they didn't exist, because it would be stupid to say that as well, but they were usually something that had much more to, and especially in their case, the problem was that obviously the Vandals were Aryans. And also in here, there were lots of other Germanic populations that were Aryans at this time, including the Visigoths and all. But eventually, these guys eventually, the populations that eventually converted to Catholicism were eventually praised, like the Visigoths. But that happened later, and telling the truth, the Vandals, as we will see, were wiped out eventually in the 6th century. I mean, it's not that you can accuse the Vandals of being too much resistant to to conversion, because actually the timing is more or less the one of other populations that eventually were converted to Catholicism. So even in here, this Vandalic resistance to this Vandal persecution of the Catholics is not even something that seems to be more intense than other Arian persecution of the Catholics. So just for saying that there is nothing intrinsically Vandalic within the Vandals, and that it's really an historiographical myth in part. At least we have no measure, once again, to say that whether they were better or worse than others. Other important point that I wanted to say is that the main problem actually occurred because of the Vandal position into the Mediterranean, because from Africa, as we have seen, they were threatening Italy. They were essentially cutting off the supplies. So actually, West and East, that at that time in the Roman Empire were already kind of two separate things de facto, even if that was just an administrative repetition, eventually joined up to try to claim back Africa from the Vandals, to get it back. This expedition, there was a huge expedition that actually took place in 468, with the help essentially of the Eastern Roman Navy. That sent, we have, probably it's exaggerated, but it kind of seemingly were 1,000 ships and 100,000 soldiers sent in there. Obviously 100,000 soldiers it's an impossible number, because at that time the Eastern Roman Empire didn't have such an amount of troops to spare for that. But it still witnesses the enormous importance that even in the whole Roman strategic perspective, Africa had, in order for the two parts of the Western and East to join together to take it back. And at that point, it happened something. We're in 468. By the way, I should have said that from Italy, the Western Roman Empire had, under Majorianus, the emperor, had invested all the last manpower and resources of Italy, with the perfect awareness that there would have been no more for generations after that expedition, to go take the to go retake Spain and Africa. At that point, basically, the Italian army entered into Spain, and the Visigoths surrendered. The Visigoths said, "Okay, we come back being federati of Rome. We give you, send us elsewhere, as you do with all the other federati on the, on the frontier, as long as you leave us alive." In practice. So that tells you how this happened very late in time. We were in the late 50s of the 5th century, just for saying that actually the Western Roman Empire wasn't really ran out of power yet. It was still capable of, from Italy, that was basically the only thing that had remained to them, if not part of Noricum and other Balkanic areas, to go to Spain and to crush the Visigoths, because we have the impression that the Germanic peoples arrived and they ruled with an iron fist. No, they were in deep crisis as much as the Romans when they settled in these depopulated lands. I mean, those lands had been left by the Romans usually because they couldn't provide much for their self-defense, so even if the Germanic peoples brought new demographical resources, that's basically all they had in there. So the Visigoths surrendered to the Romans, and the expedition of Majoran was in 460, not in late 50s. But the Vandals basically, after having curbed the Visigoths, he passed to the Vandals, and in this there was essentially a naval battle in front of Cartagena, and he met the Vandals in there, and he was defeated. So the Vandals defeated. Genseric was still there. Genseric was still the king of the Vandals. So this guy managed to defeat the army of Majoran, so in saving Africa from further invasion. And at the Battle of Cape Bon in 468, when this huge Eastern Roman fleet arrived to conquer Africa to the Vandals, Genseric decided to stand, even if the situation was hopeless, and they basically managed to burn the whole fleet of the Eastern Romans. There was also probably some treachery involved, and he saved the Vandalic kingdom. So Genseric is considered this hero of the Vandal people, because I'm sure that if another king had been there when a Roman fleet of 1,000 ships had approached, everybody would have done like the Visigoths, like hands up, we surrender, we don't want to mess with you. Instead, Genseric had the guts to stand, to destroy this in a hopeless situation, because the Roman forces were enormous, and yet he stood against them and won. So Genseric is this, he died 9 years later, so he is this extraordinary figure of the Roman world, of the migration era, that is rightfully, in my opinion, considered actually the cause of the end of the Western Roman Empire. Because if he had not, first of all, he cut off supplies to Italy. So that was a very heavy blow to the Western Roman Empire. Secondly, he defeated both Majoranus and Byzantine and Basiliscus, who was the leader of the Eastern Roman naval expedition. So in both those occasions, he basically saved the Vandal kingdom from annihilation. If the Romans had defeated either the Vandals at Cartagena decisively, or they had conquered Africa with the fleet of Basiliscus, I'm personally convinced that Western Roman Empire would have survived, and up to at least the Arab invasions, and probably beyond, however, because Africa at that point would have been lost anyway. But the narrative that Western Roman Empire was doomed, like, yeah, because it was like, yeah, it had to fall, yeah, the Germans have destroyed that. No, it's completely false. It is not true. There were resources to evidently to claim Spain back, to claim Africa back, and it's simply because of political and military events that there was nothing structural. It wasn't written that Western half had to fall. So in my opinion, Genseric was this extraordinary man, after which in fact the Vandal kingdom entered into crisis. The crisis of the Vandalic kingdom is something physiological, really, in the story of the Romano-Germanic world, because you understand that every Germanic people that eventually settled down ended up to lose cohesion and to decline. This happened for the Merovingian Franks, it happened for the Visigoths, it happened partly to the Longobards, even though the Longobards actually developed, with the Longobards it didn't really happen because they lost their warlike character, but they made a huge advance in civilizations in terms of political and administrative structures, so it is not really true. But relatively to the original core of these populations, these warlike peoples into which basically all the male freemen were militarized and they lived off of war, it all ended when they settled down into a world that could definitely allowed them to live in a different way. I mean, the Germans weren't warlike because there was any particular cultural, decision that they had taken. They were warlike because the only way to live in the environment of Central Europe and of the steppes was to raid, because there was not enough surplus to live in another fashion. So that's why we're so highly militarized. And when they instead settled down in rich territories like Italy, Spain, Africa, etc., they obviously lost their own military nature. Also, demographically speaking, there weren't many, especially in these last regions that we have mentioned. I mean, there were millions inhabiting there. And they were just several tens of thousands. So even from a demographical point of view, after 2 or 3 generations, we're already blended in with the Roman or Romanized populations. So really, there is nothing strange about it. The decline of the Vandals seemingly has derived also in here. There is a certain historiography that says, oh, it was still about the fact that they were Arian and that they didn't convert to Catholicism, so this brought to internal strife. In my opinion, it's a bit different than this. In my opinion, is that behind these religious clashes there were political reasons. You can see that everywhere. First of all, more than behind Catholicism, you have to think that it was essentially the presence of a Roman aristocracy, of the one of famous senatorial class, that just like it happened with the Ostrogoths into Italy, was kind of collaborating with the Germans, but at the same time we're still hoping that the Byzantines would arrive and reabsorb, let's say, reintegrate them into the senatorial, system of the empire from an economical point of view. These were landowners. They were people who had their own ambitions. They were cultural elite. They were very traditionalist. They had this kind of concealed contempt for the Germans that they considered barbarians, and they loathed in some measure. really the rest of the population was probably neutral to this schemes. Like they saw the Germanic populations like just like the usual ruler that already existed before. Some of them surely had suffered confiscations and stuff like that, but generally speaking there is no evidence of a great. If anything, the Freeman Germanic model was something in terms of social justice probably conceived as more sympathetic than the elitary one of the aristocracy. You have to think that at this time Roman society had this very few extremely wealthy people that had basically all the estates of the provinces, and a wall load of poor, very poor people. So we know even in Italy, basically the Ostrogoths at a certain point freed the colons, the peasants, to make them join fighting against the Byzantines who wanted to reprisinate the senatorial aristocracy after the war had ended in the Great Gothic War. So we shouldn't see this kind of popular contrasts against the Vandals in Africa, because it doesn't really make sense. And even within the same Vandal court, you have to think there were factions, there were sides. Even in Lombard history, a bit later in time, especially in the 7th century, you find this thing that, this guy was Arian and this guy was Catholic, so they kind of clashed against each other because of this religious factor. But if you really study the sources, you realize that religious orientation actually concealed completely different interests that were based on politics and society, on economy, and it was just a name. Arian and Catholic. And this, I think that it happened the same way in the Vandalic kingdom. There was also a so-called Vandal Renaissance at a certain point during this phase. So it seems that the Vandals had actually been able to make the Africa flourish in some measure, in spite of all the prejudice that exists on them, and relatively to them. There's been some literary compositions. Unfortunately, most of them are lost. Trade, manufacturers. That was essentially was a well-off place. Still, it was really the political control that was a bit weak, because indeed the Vandals were a few. They had necessarily to integrate with local aristocracies, or at least to give up partly of their original idea of controlling the whole thing without without actually turning one against the other, because that's how it happened. Once they had settled down and they had seized land, they had seized power. If you take what was happening in Visigothic Kingdom of Spain, you had basically the nobility shared, all had this lots of land on their own that they had seized during the conquest, and they didn't want the kings from Toledo to enlarge their power onto them. And these were actually the main problems of the Romano-Germanic kingdoms that not all of them had. Like Lombard Italy or Anglo-Saxon Britain, for instance, were a bit different in this sense. We should look more. We are talking here about very Romanized places into which the Roman culture had remained relatively untouched, undestroyed, as Ostrogothic Italy, Africa, and Vandal Africa, and Visigothic Spain. So all these regions had they're kind of similar under this point of view. The decline of the Vandals is seen also because, as we've seen, they weren't these hugely strong people. Genseric was an extremely effective ruler. He was determined, skilled, and he managed to fence the attacks off. But you realize also in there that the Vandals were at that point on the defensive. when the Ostrogoths migrated into Italy and they seized it from Odoacer, that had opposed the last Roman emperor. At least there was also Nepos, that is the true last Roman emperor, but let's say it's at least in Italy that was happened. Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, actually was able to claim back Sicily from the Vandals. So you had this Ostrogothic Italy at that point was the real giant of the Mediterranean, of the Western Mediterranean, and the Vandals kind of shrank a little. So you understand that at that point they were a kind of weak entity, and their weakness was essentially expressed by more than else by their turbulent end, that is the so-called Vandalic War, about which perhaps I discussed in the videos I made about the Byzantine reconquest of the western provinces. I think I made 2 videos about that, and I discussed about this topic, telling the truth. If you want to go check that, it's in the Byzantine history playlist, if I'm not wrong. So as we all know, the Vandal Africa was the first province that the Byzantine general Belisarius conquered in this huge Justinian project of reconquest of the western regions. It's very meaningful because it tells you that probably Africa, the main goal was recovering Italy. And in this sense, from a strategical point of view, it kind of makes sense to take Africa first, because it's Belisarius seized, it did a bit like the Allies in World War II. It seized first of all Africa, then Sicily, and then it passed to Italy. That was a mess, by the way, as a war. I mean, Africa fell quite easily, as we will see with the Vandals. The Vandals basically fought 2 battles. The battle at the Decimum and the one of Tricamarum. We are in 533, and that's when the Vandal kingdom basically finished. And then it seized Italy, so they seized Sicily and they passed to Italy. The battle at Decimum was the last stand of the Vandals. I mean, it wasn't really the last stand of the Vandals, it was, let's say, the official stand of the Vandals under the king Gelimer. Gelimer had actually deposed the former king, who was his cousin, Hilderic. I mean, it's all part of this kind of political strife that had followed after the death of Genseric. And so basically Gelimer to quickly assembled his army and met Belisarius at the Battle of Decimum. He was defeated. But as it often happens with these Germanic peoples, there is always a sort of last stand. This is something you find with the Ostrogoths in the same wars against Belisarius, even at the Frankish conquest of Italy, of Lombard Italy. I think with the Arabs in Spain it didn't happen. I mean, it was just one battle, and then there wasn't really any other stand. But in this sense, Visigothic society had transformed pretty much. But even at the beginning of the 6th century, the Vandals evidently had this Germanic idea that you have to fight till the very end. So they met up once again at the Battle of Tricamarum, where the Vandals fought well, just like in the first part. I mean, they showed they proved their courage that they definitely had and all, but they were defeated. I mean, the Byzantine army at that time was, first of all, Belisarius was a hell of a commander, but also the Byzantine army was a pretty advanced, probably, it was definitely the most advanced army, at least in the Mediterranean. Yeah, I mean, they ended there. So what was the fate of the Vandals? Well, as most of these Germanic populations that eventually went lost, and ethnically, I mean, as a political entity, practically, it was still, it's not that they were all exterminated or they went away. Some, of course, died. Some remained where they were. Probably they all had their why not a Vandal knight arriving to Africa probably seized that the African girls that he appealed the most, that he liked the most, and generated this kind of. But it's this is sort of story of the world. People intermarried and they descend from various origins. So some of them remained into Africa. Some of them fled. Actually, some of them we know that they fled to Spain, which is interesting because, by the way, southern Spain was eventually seemingly seized by the Byzantines in a time that we don't really know. We don't know whether it happened before or after the Byzantine reconquest of Italy, but at a certain point the Byzantines reconquered the southern lands of Spain. That tells you how the Visigoths weren't this big power, but probably some of the Vandals kind of said, okay, we once came from Spain, from there, so let's restart from there. Some of the Vandals were resettled actually in other regions of North Africa by the Byzantines, because at that point the Byzantine problem was also to maintain. This is one of the greatest criticisms towards, strategically speaking, to Justinian's reconquest of the western regions. The problem is that you could reconquest them, but you have to keep holding them. Actually, even the same conquest of the Vandal kingdom is being criticized. I probably would have done the same, but let's say that the problem is that after this period, Byzantine Africa saw, as we were saying, lots of revolts. By the way, there were the Berbers, the native African populations of the hinterland that had began actually to harass the Vandals before the end of the kingdom, and they were pretty nasty because they made guerrilla more than else. So the Vandals were not so many, so even that's the best way to basically wear them out in terms of manpower and all. And the Byzantines faced the same problem, so they spent lots of money to send garrisons there to defend. See, I mean, Africa turned out to be expensive as a reconquested land, but still, at least for resisting Italy, was of some help, I believe, and kind of made sense to reconquest it. So what the Byzantines did, in part, and this is what they did also in Italy with the Goths, is actually to maintain certain Vandal garrisons here and there in North Africa. So saying, now we are being wiped out as a political entity, but we let you stay in there because they had their houses in there, and they had forms of autonomous military organization of garrisoning and stuff for their own defense. So they said, stay in here and we will do. Another thing that was done actually, and this happened also frequently, is that probably the best the best troops, especially cavalry, Vandal cavalry, was basically integrated into the Byzantine army. The Vandals, as many, especially Eastern Germanic peoples, had definitely good cavalry. I don't know how probably this had actually Africa had, because the problem is that with the Goths, for instance, is that the Goths were probably, the Ostrogoths were some of the best cavalrymen among the Germanic populations, probably even the best for certain standards. The problem is that when they arrived in Italy, so they had moved from the steppe, then when there were plenty of horses, then into the Balkans, and then into Italy. The main problem, and we know it from the Gothic War, is against Belisarius, is that the Goths didn't have in Italy the horses that they needed, because Italy has good horses, but it doesn't have many. and it's not really an extremely good place and therefore they lacked that. So they partly had lost that kind. Instead, Africa historically had always great horses and great horsemen. By the way, so it's likely that the Vandals, when settling in Africa, could keep a decent cavalry tradition from the one they had probably before migrating in there, considering they had integrated peoples like the Alans, as we've seen, and they were probably some of the best cavalrymen of the ancient world. So this really adds to that and to their cavalry skills, and the choicest Vandal warriors were integrated into the so-called Vandali Justiniani, that is essentially in Latin. There was still the language of the Byzantine army, the Justinian Vandals in practice, and they fought along to Byzantine military. And this was normal practice, really. So the Vandals were a bit killed, a bit remaining there, a bit fled, a bit were enrolled by the Byzantines. So yeah, this is chiefly their end. I don't know how much modern-day Tunisia remembers the Vandals as part of their history, because they're probably all about Islam, and but it's still, nationalism is something that has poured even into the Islamic world in some fashion, and I'm sure that in Tunisia that there is someone who thinks, so look at the time of the Vandals when we owned great parts of the Mediterranean, and I'm surely probably there is some Vandal legacy into Tunisia. For the rest, the Vandal legacy really stands in this contemporary term of vandalism that takes the name after them, and I really dislike it, because as we have seen, it's really groundless, and it was probably, and more heinously in this sense, due to 19th century stereotypes, like this terrible depiction of the fall of Rome that was considered like this terrible disaster that happened so brutally. And well, as we know today, the whole thing was much more, it was tough, but it was much softer, much more progressive. Things could take another path, and that was a brutal world in the first place, and therefore it's not even fault probably of the papal propaganda and all. I mean, this or the sack of Rome. It's really that we have over we have really decided to take the Vandals arbitrarily as this terrible people that probably they weren't, like and even if they raided definitely extensively as any other power at the time did, and pillaging is killed and all, but really the migration race, it was all about that. It was normal deal, I'd say. However, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel. I think that I will keep doing in the future similar videos to this. I really would like to make a list of all the peoples of the migration era and see if, because as I was saying in the beginning, I noticed that many of you are interested about these topics, and I'm glad to discuss them if I can. For now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye!